before the world knew him as Cliff Richard. He was simply Harry Webb, born on October 14, 1940, in Lucknow, British India. His early life was far from the fame and bright lights that would later define him. The world he was born into was chaotic, a country on the brink of change, with the British Empire collapsing and India fighting for independence. The Webb family lived under constant tension. Riots filled the streets, violence was everywhere, and the safe, comfortable life many British families had once known in India was rapidly disappearing. By 1946, the situation was unbearable. The streets burned with protests, and families like the Webbs had to escape, leaving everything behind. Their journey wasn't glamorous or easy. Crammed onto the aging passenger ship, SS Ranchi, they joined hundreds of other families fleeing to Britain. For 3 long weeks, they crossed rough seas, uncertain of the future waiting for them. When they arrived in post-war England, the difference was stark. Gone were the warm Indian nights and grand homes. Instead, they found cold, gray skies, ration books, and streets still scarred by war. The family settled in Cheshunt, a modest town in Hertfordshire. Life was simple and hard, but it planted a determination in young Harry. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted more. Harry was drawn to music early on. Like many teenagers, he admired Elvis Presley and Little Richard. But in post-war Britain, dreams of becoming a star felt impossible. British music was clean, polished, predictable. Rock and roll was an American invention, and few believed Britain could create anything to rival it. But Harry had other ideas. At 18, with a guitar in his hands and ambition burning inside him, he knew he couldn't conquer the music world with the name Harry Webb. That's when fate stepped in. His manager suggested something bold, a stage name. It had to sound solid, British, unshakable. Cliff, they decided, strong, like the rock face. And Richard, as a tribute to Little Richard, the wild American rock star Harry admired. And just like that, Cliff Richard was born. But it wasn't only a name, it was a new identity. A young man ready to prove that British music could stand tall on the world stage. No more copying America. It was time to show the world that Britain could produce its own rock star. And it all began with one song that would shake the country and the music industry to its core. In 1958, Britain's music scene was safe, clean, and predictable. Songs were polite, singers were polished, and nothing felt rebellious. That was about to change, thanks to an 18-year-old named Cliff Richard. Cliff had been working hard, playing small shows, determined to break through. But it wasn't until he stepped into a recording studio to sing Move It that everything changed. The song didn't sound like anything Britain had heard before. It was raw, loud, and full of attitude. It had the energy of American rock and roll, but with a British edge. The lyrics were simple, but the message was clear. This wasn't safe, polite pop music. This was something new. When Move It hit the airwaves in August 1958, it caused an uproar. Teenagers went wild for it. Suddenly, British youth had their own anthem and their own rock star. The song shot up the charts, reaching number 2, and Cliff Richard was no longer just a hopeful musician. He was the face of a new British sound. Many believed British rock didn't exist before Cliff. Even John Lennon once admitted, before Cliff Richard and Move It, there was nothing worth listening to in England. With Move It, Cliff didn't just start a music career. He kicked off a movement. His success showed the world that Britain could create its own stars, its own sound, its own rock revolution. The impact was instant. Crowds packed his shows. Fans screamed, cried, fainted. Reporters called it Cliff Mania. Girls chased him down the street, and his concerts turned into chaos. Britain had never seen anything like it. But Cliff wasn't done. In 1959, he released Living Doll. At first, he didn't like the song. He thought it sounded cheesy and fake, but his band, The Shadows, changed the arrangement, slowing it down, giving it a new style. To Cliff's surprise, it worked. Living Doll reached number 1, staying there for 6 weeks and selling over 770,000 copies. His next hit, Travelin' Light, did even better, topping the charts for another 5 weeks. Suddenly, Cliff Richard wasn't just popular, he was making history. No British artist had sold over 1 million records before him. But for Cliff, This was never just about fame. It was about proving himself, showing Britain and the world that he could lead the way. His early success opened the door for every British rock star that followed. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all of them came after. And though the world would eventually celebrate them, it was Cliff who kicked the door open first. But fame, as Cliff would learn, comes with a price, and his toughest battles were still to come. By 1959, Cliff Richard was more than just a singer. He was a national sensation. His songs were topping the charts, his concerts were selling out, and Cliff Mania was spreading across the country. But Cliff wasn't satisfied with being known only for music. He wanted to take on something bigger. Hollywood came calling. His first film, Serious Charge, wasn't the usual lighthearted musical. It was bold, tackling serious subjects like false accusations and moral judgment. Cliff was only 19, but he wanted to show he was more than a pop star with a pretty face. The film surprised critics. Cliff's performance proved he wasn't afraid to take risks, even early in his career. He wanted to challenge himself, to push boundaries, on screen and in music. Next came Espresso Bongo in 1960, a sharp, satirical look at the music industry. It mocked the fame machine Cliff himself was part of, but instead of damaging his reputation, it showed the world that Cliff Richard could laugh at himself and still deliver. But it was Summer Holiday in 1963 that truly cemented his status as a household name. The film was a colorful, feel-good story about a group of friends traveling across Europe in a red London bus. But when it premiered in London, chaos erupted. Over 3,000 fans packed Leicester Square. The crowd was so wild, Cliff couldn't even get out of his car to walk the red carpet. He missed his own premiere, but it didn't matter. Summer Holiday became a cultural phenomenon. The soundtrack shot to #1 before the film even hit cinemas. The songs, The Next Time, Bachelor Boy, and the title track Summer Holiday dominated the airwaves. Even the Shadows' instrumental, Foot Tapper, climbed to #1. The film became the second highest grossing movie of the year, just behind From Russia with Love. In the same year, Cliff was voted the UK's most popular film star. But fame is fragile, and change was coming. The Beatles exploded onto the scene in 1963, and many assumed Cliff's days at the top were numbered. British music was shifting, the industry evolving, and young bands were grabbing the spotlight. But Cliff wasn't ready to disappear. While the Beatles conquered America in 1964, Cliff quietly held his ground at home. He released 6 top 10 singles, including Constantly, On the Beach, and I Could Easily Fall in Love with You. His music adapted, evolving with the times. Even the Beatles admitted they owed him. Paul McCartney once said they went to Hamburg to escape Cliff's dominance. John Lennon famously declared, "Before Cliff, there was nothing worth listening to in England." Cliff had laid the foundation. The new wave of British music was building, but they were standing on the ground he'd cleared. But Cliff's biggest transformation was still ahead, a decision that would shock fans, risk his career, and redefine his life forever. By the mid-1960s, Cliff Richard had everything a young star could want: fame, success, and fans screaming his name wherever he went. But behind the scenes, Cliff was searching for something more. The pressure of constant performances, media attention, and living up to his image was taking its toll. He was famous, but not fulfilled. Cliff later admitted that much of his confident, rebellious image had been an act. Deep down, he was questioning everything: his future, his purpose, and what truly mattered to him. In June 1966, Cliff made a decision that stunned the country. At Earl's Court in London, thousands of fans had gathered, expecting to hear music. But instead of singing, Cliff stood beside American evangelist Billy Graham and made an announcement that sent shockwaves through Britain. Cliff Richard had become a Christian. It was unexpected. The 1960s were defined by rebellion, free love, and rock and roll excess. Many fans couldn't understand how the face of British pop music was now openly talking about faith. For some, it felt like betrayal. For others, it was confusing. And for Cliff, it was the most personal decision of his life. The media reacted quickly. Headlines questioned whether his career was over. Music insiders whispered that Cliff was finished. Agents pulled back, fearing he'd walk away from entertainment entirely. Fans worried he'd trade fame for a quiet life away from the spotlight. Cliff himself struggled with doubts. Could he balance fame and faith? Was it possible to stay true to his beliefs and still perform on the biggest stages? For a time, even Cliff wasn't sure. But he didn't run, and he didn't hide. Instead, Cliff made history once again. He proved that a pop star could keep his faith and his career. He refused to play a role or put on an act. The fake rebellious image faded, replaced by a more confident, authentic Cliff Richard. "My confidence grew," he later said. The pressure to pretend disappeared. He wasn't just performing for applause anymore. He was being himself. His music reflected the change. The songs had more depth. His interviews were honest. And despite predictions of failure, Cliff's career didn't collapse. In fact, it endured. While many artists of the 60s faded away, lost to time or scandal, Cliff remained. His faith didn't weaken him, it strengthened him. But even with this new identity, success wasn't guaranteed. By the mid-1970s, Cliff's chart-topping days seemed behind him. The world was changing again. Music was louder, harder, edgier. Cliff looked like a star from a different era. But his biggest comeback was just around the corner. And when it arrived, no one, not even his critics, saw it coming. By the mid-1970s, Cliff Richard's career was struggling. For nearly 2 decades, he had dominated the charts, but now, it seemed like the world was moving on. New bands, louder sounds, and rebellious attitudes were everywhere. Many believed Cliff couldn't keep up. The teenager who once shook up British music was at risk of being forgotten. But Cliff wasn't finished, not even close. In 1976, Cliff released a song that changed everything, Devil Woman. It was nothing like the clean-cut pop songs people expected from him. Devil Woman was dark, gritty, and mysterious. It told the story of a man caught in the grip of a psychic's curse and bad luck, with a haunting melody and a rock edge no one saw coming. The song didn't just surprise listeners, it shocked them. Suddenly, Cliff Richard was back in the charts, not as a former teen idol, but as a mature, relevant artist with a bold, new sound. Devil Woman reached number 9 in the UK, but the bigger achievement came across the Atlantic. For the first time, Cliff broke into the American top 10, with Devil Woman climbing to number 6 on the US charts. The song sold over 2 million copies worldwide, proving that Cliff Richard wasn't a relic of the past. He was a force to be reckoned with. Even the toughest critics started paying attention. The rock world, which had once dismissed him, embraced his comeback. Legends like Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Elton John were spotted wearing badges with the words "I'm Nearly Famous," the title of Cliff's new album. The album wasn't just a hit, it marked a complete reinvention. Gone was the polished, safe pop star image. In its place stood an artist willing to take risks, explore new sounds, and stay true to himself. For Cliff, the success of Devil Woman wasn't just about the music. It was about proving that belief, determination, and reinvention could keep him standing in an industry that often chewed people up and spat them out. Critics even compared "I'm Nearly Famous" to some of the greatest albums of the era. It was a turning point, a reminder that Cliff Richard still belonged on the world stage. But the comeback didn't stop there. The late 70s brought more hits, more tours, and more success. Cliff was filling arenas, topping charts, and showing the world that even after heartbreak, setbacks, and doubts, he could rise again. But for all the success, Cliff's personal life remained complicated. The world saw the fame and the music, but behind the scenes, there was a love story few knew about. A story that would follow him for decades and leave a mark that never truly healed. For all his success, one thing was missing from Cliff Richard's life: a lasting love. The world watched him top charts, sell out concerts, and reinvent himself. But when it came to romance, Cliff stayed quiet. He never married. He never had children. And for years, people wondered why. But behind the silence was a love story few ever realized. A story that began in 1971, when Cliff met a young Australian singer named Olivia Newton-John. Cliff was already a household name. Olivia was just 22, new to the UK music scene, and trying to find her place. Cliff invited her to perform on his television show, and the connection between them was instant. On stage, their voices blended perfectly. Off stage, There was an unspoken bond. Cliff later admitted, "I knew right away she was a friend for life." But it was more than friendship. Quietly, Cliff had fallen for her. There was only one problem. Olivia was engaged. Not just to anyone, but to Bruce Welch, Cliff's close friend and bandmate from the Shadows. It was a heartbreak Cliff rarely spoke of publicly. Watching the woman he loved stand beside his best friend was a silent pain that never truly faded. Olivia and Bruce's relationship wasn't simple. The tabloids loved the drama. Bruce was still married when they first met, and their 5-year engagement was filled with ups and downs. All the while, Cliff and Olivia kept performing together. They toured the world, shared stages, and recorded unforgettable duets like Suddenly and When I'm 64. Their chemistry was undeniable. Rumors flew. Had Olivia left Bruce for Cliff? Was there more happening behind the scenes? Neither of them ever confirmed it. But the silence, the lingering looks, the closeness, spoke volumes. Despite the rumors, Cliff never moved on. While his career thrived, his personal life stayed still. The love he had for Olivia remained, hidden from the headlines, tucked away behind decades of performances and fame. Their final duet came in 2015, at Cliff's 75th birthday concert. Fittingly, the song was Suddenly. One last time. It wasn't just a performance, it was a quiet, emotional goodbye. 3 weeks before Olivia passed, Cliff called her. She sounded positive, warm, still fighting. But cancer was winning a battle she had fought for 30 years. On August 8, 2022, Olivia Newton-John died. For Cliff, it was devastating. He couldn't even bring himself to say the word death. Instead, he simply told the world, she stopped living. The woman he loved was gone. And with her, a piece of his heart that had been quietly broken for 50 years. But as painful as losing Olivia was, Cliff's greatest public heartbreak, one that would nearly destroy him, was still to come. It was August 14, 2014, a day that would haunt Cliff Richard forever. He was sitting in his home in Portugal, flicking through TV channels, when he saw it. The nightmare playing out live on his screen. Helicopters hovered over his house in Berkshire. Police officers swarmed the property. News reporters circled, broadcasting every second to millions of viewers. At first, Cliff was confused. His home was being raided, but why? His first thought was chilling. It looks like they're being burgled. But this was worse than a break-in. The BBC, in a secret agreement with South Yorkshire Police, had set the scene. They called it the money shot. They wanted drama, ratings, and headlines, and Cliff Richard's private life became their spectacle. The reason? A man, now in his 40s, had accused Cliff of assault. The alleged incident supposedly happened in 1985, at a Billy Graham Christian rally. But from the start, nothing about the story added up. The room the accuser described? It didn't exist at the time. The sports equipment mentioned? Stored elsewhere entirely. Cliff's own security team, who were with him that night, were never interviewed. Logic didn't seem to matter. The images of the raid were broadcast globally. Cliff watched helplessly as strangers picked through his belongings, as the media dissected his life, all without a single charge laid. He collapsed, sobbing in his kitchen. The stress was unbearable. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He lost weight. He developed shingles from the pressure. His home, once a place of safety, now felt contaminated, as he described it. For nearly 2 years, the investigation dragged on, consuming his life. No charges were ever filed. Not one shred of evidence was produced. But the damage was already done. The BBC, shockingly, even submitted their live raid coverage for Scoop of the Year. While Cliff battled depression, fear, and humiliation, they celebrated the destruction of his reputation. The headlines painted him guilty long before the truth emerged. Friends stayed silent. Strangers whispered. Doors that were once open slammed shut. The hardest part? Living in fear. Some days, Cliff couldn't lift his arms. Other days, he couldn't even face the world outside. He described those years as being a prisoner in my own home. Then came the blackmail attempt. A man, knowing the raid had shattered Cliff's life, threatened him with false stories unless he paid. That man was arrested, but unbelievably, his lies were still considered by investigators. But Cliff wasn't ready to be destroyed. He fought back, this time in court. In 2018, after years of public shame, Cliff won his legal battle. The court ruled the BBC had invaded his privacy in a sensationalist and arrogant way. They were ordered to pay nearly $2 million in damages. But money couldn't erase the scars. His reputation, his trust in people, his peace of mind, those were lost. And yet, through it all, Cliff Richard stood unbroken. The legal battle was over, but the pain remained. Cliff Richard had cleared his name, but the stain of suspicion lingered. He often said, "You can win in court, but you can't erase every whisper, every look." The public raid, the false accusations, and the relentless headlines had changed him, but they hadn't destroyed him. Cliff Richard had faced heartbreak, humiliation, and betrayal, and still, he stood. Long before the BBC raid, Cliff had been fighting personal battles, many that the world never saw. Losing Olivia Newton-John, the woman he quietly loved for decades, was one of them. His decision to stay unmarried and childless had often puzzled fans, but for Cliff, his life was never about following a script. His childhood, fleeing a collapsing empire in India, had taught him one lesson: survival, and survival shaped his every move. When he reinvented himself with Devil Woman, when he declared his Christian faith on a public stage, when he faced down a media storm, every time, Cliff chose to survive, to rebuild, to keep going. Even after the raid, when most would have hidden away, Cliff returned to what he loved: music, concerts, tours, recordings. He refused to let scandal define him. Fans around the world showed their loyalty. His concerts still sold out. His albums still charted. Despite everything, the man who helped create British rock and roll was still filling venues 6 decades after his first hit. And the industry never forgot his impact. Even his rivals had admitted it. John Lennon once declared, "Before Cliff Richard and Move It, there was nothing worth listening to in England." Paul McCartney himself had acknowledged they left for Hamburg because Cliff had everything sewn up at home. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the entire British invasion, they followed a path Cliff had carved. But Cliff never let that legacy make him arrogant. His career was a marathon, not a sprint. And through the highs and the crushing lows, he stayed grounded. Fame came, scandals came, even heartbreak came, but Cliff's belief in himself never faded. He later admitted, "I never set out to change music history. I just wanted to sing." But in doing so, he helped reshape British culture, surviving when others couldn't. His story isn't just about fame or hit songs. It's about resilience. The quiet battles no one saw. The courage to start over, again and again. Cliff Richard lost the woman he loved. He faced public humiliation. He battled the shadows of false accusations. But through it all, he never disappeared. Today, he remains more than a music icon. He is a symbol of survival, proof that even the hardest knocks can't silence a man who refuses to fall. Cliff Richard, the boy from British India, the teen who changed music, the man who defied the odds, remains unshaken.